Okay, the recording is now in progress. I'm going to open up the chat. Pastor Rocky said that he may or may not be on because of the intermittent Wi-Fi connection he has there. Excuse me. All right, why don't we go ahead and get started with prayer? I'm sure there'll be others who meander in over time, so we can welcome them as they come in, but it'll be good for us to get started. I have to I have to sign off right around 8 o'clock, so I can't go too late today. And I apologize for last week. That was completely my fault. It just my I didn't set my alarm and I woke up too late. So
It's
this
okay.
morning, thank you for your graciousness. This morning I did set my alarm and I woke up before the alarm went off, so I didn't need my alarm this week, but I needed it last week. Anyway, that's the way things go. All right, let's begin with prayer. Father, thank you for this day and for the brothers in the Philippines. Thank you for bringing them through this day. Father, we pray that you would fill their hearts with gratitude for your mercies shown to them this day, to the church that is there in the Philippines, and for the witness of Jesus Christ as it goes forth there. We pray, equip us now and prepare us to be lights in the midst of a dark world, that we would be equipped and trained to effectively defend the faith and to hold out and to show forth Jesus Christ as he is offered to us in the gospel, even offered freely. It's in his name we pray. Amen. All right. So early morning here, and I'm still sort of clearing my throat and my lungs and all of that from sleeping. So I apologize. Of course, you all have been putting up with that for quite some time now. Okay. Uh, so I had the chat open. If you have any questions, please feel free to go ahead and jot your questions down in the chat, and I'll pick them up as we go along. Comments too. So comments or questions, all fair game. So please feel free to include all of that as things come up. And it looks like we have Pastor Rocky. All right. There he is. All right. With the two great reformers. Oh, it's only one great reformer, actually, just in two different forms. There are two great reformers, Pastor Rocky and Pastor Calvin. So two great theologians that I look up to. So all right, great. Let's go ahead and get started. If you're looking at the outline, great. If not, don't worry about it. I'll take us through it. But we are at that section, Roman numeral 3, where we're going to talk about defending the Reformed faith. And I'm going to speak briefly on this. Certainly, I could, excuse me, certainly I could talk at length about Van Til and the way in which he sought to defend the Reformed faith over against other forms of Christianity, excuse me, or other religions altogether. We're not going to talk about that at length. Again, we could, and that's actually probably its own class. That's sort of like a if this is Apologetics 101, a class like that would be like Apologetics 301, be like a advanced master's course or something. But it would be worth doing, and I would love to do that sometime. But it's not for us to dig real deeply into that here. We're just going to give the surface survey, and that's kind of what this class has been, right? We're sort of doing a surface survey of matters, and that's what we're going to do here as we talk about Van Til and the way in which he proposed that we can defend the Reformed faith over against other forms and expressions of Christianity and other religions as well. And so I want to talk just briefly about the Reformed faith over against Rome, over against Barth, over against evangelicalism, and then less consistent forms of Calvinism. Okay. And so let's go ahead and take those in turn. First of all, Rome. If you have at all had access to materials online, even at Reformed Forum, again, I'm not seeking to be self-promotional here, just referring you to resources that are out there for free. We talk a lot about at Reform Forum the deeper Protestant conception, and that term you've heard me use it before. Deeper Protestant conception. The deeper Protestant conception is an expression that Gerhardus Voss uses in his work on Reformed dogmatics. And it's set over against what he calls the deeper Catholic conception. And by Catholic there, of course, Voss has in mind Roman Catholicism. And so just speaking briefly about these things, Van Til, when he polemicizes, remember we talked about polemics as being a part of apologetics. We seek to defend Christianity over against, let's say, atheism and other forms of unbelief, but we're also seeking to defend the Reformed faith, particularly, right? We're not seeking to defend a generic form of Christianity, but the Reformed faith, because we believe that the Reformed faith is the most consistent expression of Christianity according to the scriptures. And so we're seeking to defend the Reformed faith in doing polemics over against other false expressions of Christianity or other expressions of Christianity that may be in error at significant points. And so this is a part of doing polemics. And we want to defend the Reformed faith over against Roman Catholicism. And when we do so, we begin with the idea of the deeper Protestant conception. Again, that's Voss's language. It's not Van Til's language. But of course, Van Til, as we have said before, and Voss are very much tracking in parallel ways with one another. Voss was Van Til's teacher and was his most admired teacher at Princeton Seminary. And so Van Til is getting his way of thinking from Voss. And so when Van Til polemicizes against Rome, he does so in such a way that is in many ways inspired, if you will, by the teaching of Gerhardus Voss. The deeper Protestant conception, you may recall, has to do with the idea of our doctrine of man. When we see the way in which Rome and the Reformed diverge from each other, the diverging begins at its most foundational, simple level in systematic theology, particularly at the level of our doctrine of man. Remember, for Rome, man is not created by nature in a natural, positive fellowship with God. There is in man, at the point of creation, what we have called concupiscence, which is a natural drag upon the being of man towards non-being. So there's already at the outset of creation of man, a man being set over against what it is that God has designed for him to become. Okay. Remember, man is in a position where he has not yet become what he ought to be. What he ought to be is to be one who participates in the divine nature. Man ought to elevate himself, right, to become reproportioned in his being in order that he might participate in the divine nature. Okay. This is a process called theosis or divinization. Okay. Part of the problem is that for Thomas Aquinas, particularly, there is a natural drag on man that pulls him down towards non-being. So God's answer to that is what is called the donum superadditum, the superadded gift, whereby man is elevated back up towards God, and his being is being reproportioned, that he might become able to participate in the very life of God, the divine nature. So that's sort of the point where all of the differences begin to emerge. Okay. For the deeper Protestant conception, God and man, although distinct beings, right? You've got the higher being, God is the creator, we are the creature. Okay. Nevertheless, while there is never at any point a reproportioning of the divine being for it to become a creature, right? God never becomes a creature at any point, even at the point of the incarnation. At the point of the incarnation, he takes upon himself, he adds to himself a human nature, but God's nature itself never changes, right? And likewise, for the deeper Protestant conception, the creature's nature never changes as well. It never gets reproportioned up to the divine nature. Okay. Nevertheless, creator creature distinction, though there may be, the creator and the creature are in a positive fellowship with each other, a positive communion bond that is forged by covenant. Okay. God forges at the outset of the creation of the image bearer, God in his providence establishes a covenant with Adam, right? So that immediately there is positive fellowship between God and man, while at the same time, God and man remaining distinct beings. God is infinite, eternal, and unchangeable in his being. Man is temporal and changeable in his being, right? That never changes. That always remains the same. One thing to recognize, whether we're talking about Rome or if we're talking about modern expressions of Christianity and like in liberalism or in Barthianism, the problem, according to these theologians, is a problem of ontology or metaphysics. The problem, they see what we see as being a glorious truth. The creator and the creature remain forever distinct, yet nevertheless in positive fellowship with each other. For both Rome and modern expressions of theology, the problem is that distinction. Okay. The problem is that man is not God and God is not man. And therefore, God and man, according to Rome and modernism, God and man cannot have any fellowship with each other unless and until there is a reproportioning of being, so that either God changes his being to become like man, or man's being is changed by God to become like God. Okay. In which case, in all of those expressions, what happens? They're then, remember the two circles, right? You got the creator and the creature. What happens? There's an overlap now. And there is a violation of the creator creature distinction. And the problem with all forms of confusing the creator creature distinction is quite simple. God ceases to be God. In all of those constructions of theology, when the creator creature distinction is taken away, God ceases to be God. He's no longer God. He becomes a creature. And we could talk about that in various ways. Number one, with regard to Rome. When we talk about Rome and the elevation or the reproportioning of the being of man in order to have fellowship with God, that has its consummation in what Thomas Aquinas called the beatific vision. Okay, we've talked about this before. But the beatific vision is the idea that the creature, particularly man, is able to have an intellectual comprehension of the divine being, so that there is a point in the beatific vision where the mind of man and the mind of God overlap. And the creator-creature distinction at the level of intellect, anyway, the intellectual apprehension becomes obliterated. And here's the thing. If the creature, can become divine at any point in the creature's being, he has become divine in every aspect of his being. And if God at all becomes in such a way that the creature is able to access him, then the creature is able to access him at not just one point, but at every point. So for the creature to enter into the divine being, it's not like he can enter into just one portion of the divine being. If he enters into the divine being at all, he enters into the entirety of the divine being, because God is simple, right? So God's not made up of parts. So it's not like the intellectual apprehension of God at the beatific vision is only intellectual, but it is actually a participation within the very being of God himself. Okay? And in that case, then God becomes a dualistic being. What does that mean, a dualistic being? That means that that at the point of the intellectual apprehension at the beatific vision, God becomes two natures. He becomes divine and human, or creator and creature. And at that point, like the creator creature distinction then is overcome at the beatific vision for Thomas Aquinas. And at that point, then you have what we call, and I've used this expression before, mutualism. Van Til would call it correlativity. And mutualism or correlativity means that basically the creator-creature distinction has been overcome. And if the creator-creature distinction has been overcome, then God must depend on his being, and his identity as a being must depend as much upon man or the creature as the creature would depend upon God. There is a mutual informing, there is a mutual identification between God and man once that creator-creature distinction is overcome. This is what Dr. Tipton calls backdoor mutualism. And this is simply what Van Til will call, again, I won't type it in again, but correlativity. The idea that the identity of the being of God and the identity of the being of the creature become wholly identified in a particular act. It's called backdoor by Dr. Tipton because it happens in Thomas Aquinas's eschatology, right? The beatific vision is what happens at the end. So Thomas Aquinas sneaks in this correlativity at the end of his system of theology. Now, that stands in fairly stark contrast with what you have within modern expressions of theology, like in that of Karl Barth. And you'll remember we talked briefly about Karl Barth. But Karl Barth violates the creator-creature distinction at the outset of his theology. And this is what Dr. Tipton calls front door mutualism. Okay? And with front door mutualism, and again, the front door is a reference to the fact that it happens at the outset of Barth's theology, where he says that from the very beginning, from even eternity past, there is a relationship between the creator and the creature that is mutually conceived of by way of God's act in Jesus Christ. Now, keep in mind that for Barth, God's act in Jesus Christ is a transcendent event. It's not the kind of thing that takes place in our real calendar time. Barth denies the idea that redemption or revelation take place within our real calendar time. Okay? It doesn't take place in our history. It takes place in a transcendent event. So, where redemption takes place in a transcendent event, Barth will say things like this. He'll say that not only is Jesus Christ God, but God is Jesus Christ. Now, notice the difference between those two expressions and how they get flipped around. It's perfectly orthodox to say that Jesus Christ is God. It identifies the person and the divine nature of Jesus as being divine, as being God. Perfectly legitimate orthodox theology to say so. But when you say that God is Jesus Christ, you're saying something completely different than what the Orthodox are saying. You're saying that God has his identity and his being in Jesus Christ. And in fact, that's exactly what Barth is saying. Barth, I'm going to put it in the most basic way. We can unpack this all day long, and it's a lecture. It's a class in and of itself, and we don't have time for that. But this is what it comes down to in its most simple expression. Barth affirms an approach to metaphysics called actualism. And actualism is the idea that God's being gets constituted by his acts toward us. So when God from eternity past chooses to become Jesus Christ, this is what Barth says, God has wrapped up his identity. In fact, God has become. Now that's something that's very important. Remember, for Orthodox theology, God is pure act. He doesn't become, he just is. But for Barth, there is an eternal transcendent event in which God becomes who he is in Jesus Christ. So that God's identity for Barth is never separated from the humanity of Jesus Christ. That means that at the front door of his theology, that is to say, from eternity past, God and man are wholly identified with each other. Front door mutualism. God and man are wholly identified in the divine act that is known as Jesus Christ. Okay? God is Jesus Christ. The divine nature of God can never be separated for Barth from the human nature of Jesus Christ. Okay? So now, yet once again, whether we're talking about Thomas Aquinas, backdoor mutualism, we're talking about modern theology, Karl Barth, front door mutualism, part of the problem with all of them is that correlativity wins the day. God's being and man's being become identified with one another. So you can see for Van Til how that really is the point of tension between the Reformed faith and all other expressions of Christianity. And I don't know if Van Til actually says it this way. I'll go ahead and say it. I don't know if but certainly it seems to be implied. All other expressions of Christian theology and other theologies at some point violate the creator-creature distinction. And it's only the Reformed faith, properly understood and articulated and expressed in the creeds and confessions of the Reformed Church, that maintain faithfully the creator-creature distinction. Everybody else violates it. And it's true. The more that you study the other theologies, the more you'll see this. Even in Lutheranism, there is the problem um, of there's a problem of the creator-creature distinction when it comes to Christology, right? So for Lutheranism, there is a point at the incarnation where Jesus surrenders something of his divine attributes, right? Particularly when this comes to the fore in the debates between the Reformed and the Lutheran on the Lord's Supper, because the Lutherans are trying to answer the question, well, if Christ really is present at the Lord's table, right? How is it that he could be present at every Lord's table, right, without sort of a at the same time without violating the creator creature distinction or surrendering something of his omnipresence or something of his human nature. And so there has to be a surrendering of either human nature or divine nature in order to answer the question of the real presence. And that has a backlash into their understanding of the incarnation. Anyway, that's a bunny trail. The whole point is that that all other forms of expression of theology other than the Reformed faith have a violation of the creator-creature distinction. And you can see this, and this is our next point, where Van Til polemicizes against evangelicalism. And when he talks about evangelicalism, he's basically talking about Arminianism. That's what he means by evangelical. Now we know that there are, at least here in America, we can use that language of evangelical to describe certain Christians who are also Calvinists. That's a whole other discussion. But for Van Til, just what you need to know is that when he speaks about evangelicalism, he has in mind Arminianism, particularly. And in Arminianism, we have a very similar problem that obtains. Okay. Think about it. What is the difference between Calvinism and Arminianism? The difference begins in the doctrine of God. Okay. Um, we tend to think that the 5 points of Calvinism is about salvation. It is about salvation, right? The 5 points of Calvinism over against the 5 points of the Remonstrance. The Remonstrance, the 5 points of Arminianism, that's what Dort, the canons of Dort were written against, setting forth in opposition 5 points of Calvinism. And we often think that it's all about a doctrine of salvation. And we tend to isolate the issue of salvation from the doctrine of God, but you can't do that, right? So think about it with me. If Arminianism is correct, just it's not, but for the sake of argument, follow with me the logic. If Arminianism is correct and God chooses us based on what he foresees we will do, what becomes of the absolute, unchangeable sovereignty of God? Think about it. Remember, God is simple. God is one nature. He's one being in 3 persons. God has no parts. Okay. So we rightly say that the goodness of God is not a part of God. It just is God, right? God is goodness. God's goodness is him. Goodness is not a part of God. It just is God's being. Likewise, if we talk about the mind of God, right? We're not talking about like how we have, so where's your mind? We'll say, well, it's up here. It's in my brain, right? It's my thinking part. Excuse me. Um, that's not really good anthropology, but that's what we do, right? We think of our minds as a part of us, an aspect of us. Well, God doesn't have a brain. He has a mind. And his mind just is who he is, right? God's mind is coterminous with his being. It's not an aspect or a part of his being. It just is his being, right? God is pure mind. He's pure goodness. He's pure acts, right? He's identified wholly with these things. So now think about it with me. If God's mind, think about God from eternity past. If God's mind is now thinking about the future and thinking about what the future holds, and he looks into the future and he sees you choose him, and God then forms and constitutes his mind, he conforms, if you will, his mind to your acts. What happens? God's being has been constituted by the creature. That's what it comes down to. His mind becomes, his mind is shaped, his mind is formed, and therefore his being is shaped, formed, and molded according to your free will, right? Your free actions constitute the mind of God as he predestines, according to Arminianism, as he predestines you and me on the basis of what we do, our choices, not his. If you take that position, this is what Van Til is saying. He's all over this stuff. If you take that position theologically as an evangelical or as an Arminian, you have made, I mean, it really is this stark, okay? You have made the creature God, and you have made God the subject of the creature. And what has happened in Arminian theology is that the creator-creature distinction has been turned upside down. It's been reversed. And so when Van Til is wanting to say that there are different sort of modes of expression in theology, some that are more consistent than others with the truth, with the Bible. And of course, he says that Reformed theology is the most consistently biblical expression of theology. And then he's going to go and he's going to say, well, you've got these evangelicals. They're not Reformed. So, but they're not quite as bad as Roman Catholicism. So, if you were to kind of sort of rank them, you would put, okay, the best is over here, Reformed theology. And then you've got evangelicalism, problematic, but still, okay, we can call them brothers, right? And then you've got Roman Catholicism, which is sort of the really strange elephant in the room, if you will. For Van Til, Roman Catholicism doesn't have the gospel. It's functionally apostate in all that it does and teaches, and yet there's still some things in Roman Catholicism that Van Til wants to say, hey, you know what? I mean, that puts them in a particular category. They still maintain the Trinity, even though it's a different expression of the Trinity than the Reformed have come up with, but still it's orthodox. They have an orthodox Christology, the two natures, one person kind of doctrine, right? Chalcedonian. Roman Catholicism has a number of other things that you can find that are commendable and that Reformed people would agree with. The idea of God's being as simple. I mean, that, the Reformed get that from the tradition going all the way back. The idea that God is self-contained, the idea that God is all-powerful, so forth and so on. These are things that the Reformed hold on to with the tradition. So you can say there's a lot of things that are commendable within Roman Catholicism, but still, it's not it's not in the camp of Reformed and evangelicalism, because at least evangelicalism and Reformed, we have the gospel, right? Rome does not. Rome does not have the gospel, so it puts them outside, our camp. And then you've got modernism, and modernism comes in at least two different expressions for Van Til: liberalism and Barthianism. And Van Til is going to say that both liberalism and Barthianism are a different religion altogether than Christianity. And so he's going to put them. So if you're kind of ranking them, right? You got Reformed, and then you've got evangelicalism, then you got Roman Catholicism, and then you've got modernism, modern expressions of theology in another world altogether. So that in both liberalism and Barthianism, you have a different religion than Christianity. It's not a different expression of Christianity. These are different religions altogether. And there, of course, Van Til is following the example of his teacher, J. Gresham Machen, when Machen wrote his book on Christianity and liberalism, expressing that Christianity and liberalism are not two different expressions of the same religion, but they're two different religions altogether. And so Van Til is going to pick up that mantle, and he's going to use it to polemicize against Barth. Okay, Barth has no semblance at all with regard to Orthodox theology. Okay, Orthodox theology is much closer aligned with Rome than it is with Barth or Schleiermacher. Barth and Barthianism and liberalism are two radically different religions from Christianity. Okay. All right. We got some comments here. Let me see. God is not in time nor in space like creatures. Exactly. That's right. Exactly. And where now Thomas Aquinas will affirm that up front. He'll say God is timeless, creatures are time bound. And that's true. But part of the problem is that the creature is able to be reproportioned even to the point of becoming a participant in the divine nature, so that the creature can become eternalized to a certain extent for Thomas. Ben Hur says, any distinction between process theology and open theism? Very good. Yeah, we're going to talk about process theology and open theism in a moment. So bear with me on that one. We'll get to it here quite presently. Any other questions, comments? Okay. So if you're tracking along on the outline, we have some of the polemics of Van Til against less consistent forms of Calvinism. So these are expressions of Calvinism that are less consistent as a system of theology as a whole. And so, first of all, Van Til polemicized against hyper-Calvinism and did so quite at length. And part of the reason why he spent so much time against hyper-Calvinism is twofold. I mean, first of all, because hyper-Calvinists were after him. Okay. Hyper-Calvinists were super critical of Van Til, and so Van Til is just kind of simply answering their objections. Okay. But he also found that there was a particular extreme problem in hyper-Calvinism that had to do with the doctrine of God. You'll remember, and we talked about this before. I'm not going to rehash this at length because we did talk about it before, but so somebody like Hoeksema, who was the founder of what here in America is called the Protestant Reformed Churches of North America, the PRCNA, and the OPC, the PCA, all the mainstream Reformed denominations do not have fellowship with the PRCNA. And in part, it has to do with their hyper-Calvinism. And hyper Calvinism is very much tied into a superlapse, an extreme form of superlapsarianism, which sees that God's eternal decree is such that there is a denial of any real transitions in history between uh, between states of being. So we talk about by nature we're in a state of sin, and by grace we're in a state of salvation. And they'll deny that there is ever in time or history a transition from being under God's wrath to coming under his grace. And that view of hyper Calvinism is a problem because it functionally makes God incapable of interacting with creation. Okay. Now, in answer to hyper Calvinism, there have been some unfortunate extreme overreactions on the other side. They so want to emphasize the fact that God can interact with creation that they make God actually become a part of creation. Process theology would be an example of this, right? Open theism, another example of this. But process theology, perhaps even more so, particularly as it comes to expression in somebody like Clark Pinnock. Clark Pinnock was actually a Reformed Presbyterian at one time. He was a Van Tillian, and he was trying to react against the hyper Calvinism of his day, and basically found process theology to be an attractive alternative, because at least in process theology, you have a way of making God interact with creation, become sort of a part of creation and not aloof from creation. And in process theology, basically what happens is God changes in the process of time and history. And it's basically a different expression of Arminianism. And really it's more so than that. It's Socinian. It's the idea that God's being changes as man changes. Okay. And so God doesn't know or predetermine or predestine ahead of time what is going to happen in time. But God's predestinating nature is the kind of thing that evolves in a process. The mind of God evolves in this process in which he enters into creation in the lockstep time of creation and changes with the process of time and change. And it's the same thing with open theism. The same exact idea is there with open theism. God, with open theism, which is just a new expression, really, of process theology, there are differences in the fine tuning of it, but it's the same problem. What God does is his knowledge grows with knowledge of how creation and time and history evolve. So it really is God is open to the future. Whatever the future holds and whatever becomes of the future, God himself grows and God himself learns and increases in his knowledge of what the future is going to be like according to how the future itself unfolds. And so history and creation has an autonomy even over God. Okay, that's something important to realize, that with these forms of theology, time, history, and the creature have a certain autonomy. They're a law unto themselves, even over God. And the creature then determines the being of God. And that's exactly where the problem lies, right? Because then God's no longer God. And here it is for Van Til. You cannot defend the existence or the integrity or the awesomeness of a God who is just like his creatures. It's not a being worth defending. And so when it comes to the defense of the faith, the only way to make a rational argument for the truth of Christianity is on the presupposition of the self-contained ontological trinity, a God who does not change, a God who does not become like his creatures, and a God who never and who does not have who does not make creatures that become like him. Right? Um, Creatures becoming like him, backdoor mutualism, Thomas Aquinas. God becoming like our creatures, front door mutualism, Karl Barth, Schleiermacher, Arminianism, open theism, process theism. And then just to throw, and then I'll pick up Rocky's comment here in a second, but just to also throw into the mix what we've said before in the past about Dr. K. Scott Oliphant and Dr. John Frame. Both Frame and Oliphant propose a doctrine of God very similar to what you find in process theology and open theism. Basically, what happens is with regard to Frame, God has two modes of being. The first mode of being is self-contained and unchangeable. The second mode of being is when God relates to creation in which he changes. Okay, so for Frame, God changes when he relates to creation. For Oliphant, what Oliphant argues in his book, God with Us, is that when God relates to creation, he takes to himself covenantal attributes in which and by which attributes God is able to change and to enter into the lockstep process of time and history and of mutable creation. Okay, so that for Dr. Oliphant, God's mind changes because it moves from ignorance to knowledge. So he'll talk about when God in the garden says to Adam, "Where are you?" What Oliphant wants to say is that God really doesn't know in and by way of his covenantal attributes where Adam is. When God says to Abraham, after he shows his willingness to sacrifice his son, God says, "Now I know," to Abraham, which implies for Dr. Oliphant that there was a time when God did not know. And then there is a time in which now God knows. Okay. Now, I hope you all can see the problem with that. If God at any point, whether in the creator-creature distinction or in the creator-creature relation, changes, God's no longer God. And the creature becomes of a higher being than God, because the creature determines the being of God. Okay, whether it's covenantal attributes, a second mode, Oliphant, a second mode of being, Frame, or by way of God's mind being conformed according to the free actions of the creature in the future, Arminianism and open theism. Okay, it's all bad. All right, let's pick up Rocky's comment here. God coming inside time and creation, Arminian's conception of foreknowledge is impossible. His whole essence will dissolve everything into nothing. It's like putting the whole air content of the compressor into a tiny balloon. It would blow it up into pieces. This illustration is an understatement. Yes, yeah, it's an effective illustration, though, Rocky. Right, that's perfect. Yeah, understated, yes, but it gets the point across. That's exactly right. Yeah, yeah. The creature, to put it in another way, the creature cannot contain the creator. And there's an old Latin expression for how the finite cannot contain the infinite. And I wish I could think of it right off the top of my head. It's a cool expression. Capax, that's what it is. Yeah, the old Capax doctrine. The finite cannot Capax contain the infinite. So, but that's to Rocky's illustration. All right. Any other questions, comments? All right. We made short order of that. And we have time here left. So I'm going to get into Roman numeral 4, arguing by presupposition. And Again, so much more time could have been spent on polemicizing against other theologies, and that's worth us doing. And some of you may be aware of some of the debates that are going on, at least over here in America and probably in Great Britain as well, about Van Til's understanding of Roman Catholicism and Thomas Aquinas. Won't get into that here, but just so that you're aware of it, there are extreme criticisms that have been and continue to be leveled against Van Til and his critique of Thomas and Roman Catholicism. And without really getting into it here, a lot of those criticisms are, I don't know, they're just not very helpful or good. Part of the reason why they're not helpful or good is because um, the Van Til will oftentimes speak in generalities. Okay, he'll speak about scholasticism, and when he speaks about scholasticism, he basically has in view Thomas Aquinas. And when he talks about Protestant scholasticism, what he's talking about is Reformed scholastics who actually adopt an approach to prolegomena. And we talked about this before, an approach to prolegomena, how we come to know God, etc., in a way that sort of carries over Thomas Aquinas's method. And this actually leads into our next point on arguing by presupposition. And so they'll say, well, Van Til gets Reformed scholasticism wrong. Well, he doesn't actually. Yes, he speaks in generalities. He's not being precise. He's speaking just overall in generalities, not about every single Reformed scholastic, but he's talking about those scholastics who do take over the method that's found in Thomas Aquinas. Uh, Johann Heidegger is an example of this. I have an article, or I call it an open letter at Reform Forum. It's basically a blog post where I address Heidegger's prolegomena and show really how Heidegger's prolegomena is basically Thomistic, and it's problematic. So yes, you can find carryover of Thomas within Reformed scholasticism. That's the kind of thing that Van Til is critiquing, is those who would basically say that you can prove the existence of the true God on the basis of reason alone without the aid of special revelation. And of course, we've talked about that already and why that's a problem. I won't repeat all that here, but just to keep you up to date, you know, I don't want anybody to be, misled into thinking that Van Til has said all of this about Roman Catholicism and it's gone unchecked or unopposed. It has been opposed. There are criticisms that are out there. You should at least be aware that there are criticisms that are out there, even if you haven't had a chance to look into it all yet. But that's for full disclosure's sake. Okay. Oh, I think I missed a question by Ben-Hur. Can we say that Aquinas's anthropology and Arminianisms is man's deification? Um, yes, I think that that's accurate and insightful, Ben-Hur. Thank you for that. I think that that's a commonality between Aquinas and Arminianism. And Van Til, of course, is drawing these connections all the time to inconsistent forms of Calvinism and evangelicalism, the way in which Arminianism and other less consistent form of Calvinism are sort of throwing a bone towards Catholicism, and it's a movement towards Catholicism because remember, Catholicism really is semi-Pelagian, and I mean, Augustine is pure Augustinianism. It can be argued that after Augustine, Rome surrenders pure Augustinianism. and adopts a certain form of semi-Pelagianism. And Rome really is, especially today, but even at the time of the Reformation, is semi-Pelagian to its core. It refuses to acknowledge, really in a consistent way, the full free autonomy of God, if you will. And that's a huge problem. So anyway, yeah, and Arminianism does the same. Arminianism is semi-Pelagian. And um, Van Til would go so far as to say, with regard to Old Princeton and their approach to prolegomena, Old Princeton is thoroughly Calvinist. I mean, Van Til recognizes that. But their approach to apologetics opens the door to a bone being thrown to Thomas Aquinas and semi-Pelagianism in prolegomena and in apologetics, where we're saying that we can prove certain things on the basis of common sense or on the basis of common reason, natural reason, alone. And that's the way that Old Princeton starts its apologetic, and it's a homage, really, to Aquinas, whether intended or not. Okay, Rocky says, maybe if there's a way for you to save the subtitle caption of this lecture, please do so. Maybe if there's a way for you to save subtitle. Do you want me to put it, Rocky, do you mean to put it here in the notes, or I mean in the chat?
There's a separate subtitle aside from the chat. So I was looking at it here, at it now. I can see it while you speak. There's a caption subtitle. Maybe the Zoom can record that. You are the host, so I think there's some way for you to save the subtitle. Thank you, Dr. Jim.
Oh, got it. All right. I'll try to do that. Yeah. Okay, great. All right. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about arguing by way of presupposition. Okay, and this is going to tie in really well with what we've been saying, okay, about Thomas Aquinas and other forms of apologetics and whatnot. So starting out negatively, arguing by presupposition means not arguing for the existence of God with a blockhouse method. Okay, what do we mean by blockhouse method? Blockhouse method is actually a very simple concept, and it's like what Thomas Aquinas was proposing, which is a twofold form of defending the existence of God. Okay, so the first block, if you will, think about it as a block. The first block is established by way of natural reason. Okay, natural reason can establish the idea of the existence of a higher being, of a generic God, without the particulars of the Trinity and so forth and so on. And then that's natural reason. That's what it establishes. And then you build on top of that the real true God in terms of the Trinity. Okay. And what Van Til says, basically, and he's right, is that that's dishonoring to the true God. It's dishonoring to the true God because it holds in suspense, or it holds in abeyance, the articulation of and the belief in the true God, who is the Trinity. Okay. And here's the problem with Thomas Aquinas all along. Thomas Aquinas all along believes that the pagan philosophers are able, on the basis of natural reason alone, to come to a knowledge of the true God. And Van Til saying that's impossible. Why? because a pagan philosopher doesn't have faith. It's impossible to please God without faith, says the scriptures, right? And so the God that an unbeliever comes up with by way of natural reason alone and without regeneration is an idol. It's a pagan God. It's a demon. That's what the unbelieving philosopher can come up with alone. So this blockhouse method, you start here, and then you're like, okay, I've now convinced the pagan that there's a higher being, a generic deity that exists. Now I can move on to the higher things like the Trinity and salvation and all of that stuff. And what Van Til is saying is that no, you haven't even gotten to the first step yet. If you think you've built the block by natural reason alone, you're still at zero. You're still at point zero because the pagan hasn't moved one step closer to the true God. In fact, he may have moved further away, depending on the conception of the God that he comes up with by way of natural reason, which is always and everywhere a pagan, unbelieving idol. So what he's saying, what Van Til is saying, instead, what we have to do is start with the true God. Start with the true God. You start with the triune God, the God of the Bible, the God who is self-contained, the ontological Trinity, the self-attesting Christ of Scripture. We begin there presupposing that God. And from there, we are able to show the unbeliever the existence of that God. So yes, we start with the God that we're seeking to prove. And some say that that's circular argumentation. Yeah, it is. But there's no other way to argue for the existence of God other than to compromise and to betray the true living God at the outset of our apologetic endeavor. So if you want something to take away from what I've just said, it's this. Do not compromise on the true God at the outset of your discussion with an unbeliever, right? Don't, in your mind, allow the unbeliever to set the terms and to suspend belief in the existence of the true God until such a time as certain conditions, his conditions, can be fulfilled. That's to lose the battle at the beginning. It's to sell the farm at the outset of your apologetic endeavor. You might as well cash in your chips. That's an American expression. I don't know if that translates, but you cash in your chips, sell the farm, close the doors, give up already if that's the way you're going to go about it, right? Because you've already surrendered the one true and living God in hopes that you might be able to win the unbeliever to believe in a pagan idol, which is not good at all, right? So we want to seek to prove the one true and living God. Also problematic with the blockhouse approach is that we're assuming with the blockhouse approach, the assumption is that the unbeliever is able to engage his reasoning with integrity, but he can't. His reasoning has no integrity. Why? Because his reason is totally depraved. We believe that as Calvinists, right? We don't believe that reason is a neutral tool that anybody can just pick up, believer or unbeliever, and use with integrity, right? Reason has been thoroughly corrupted by sin. And because it's been thoroughly corrupted by sin, the unbeliever cannot reason straight. Yes, he can reason. And there are many logical, rational connections that the unbeliever can recognize. But the one thing he cannot come to by way of natural reason is the existence of the true God. Cannot do it. Cannot do it. It's impossible. What he needs, number one, is faith, right? Only faith is able to reorient reason. in a truly Godward direction. Otherwise, reason, being thoroughly corrupted as it is, cannot come to a knowledge of the one true and living God. So the blockhouse approach then is faulty at the outset. We don't seek to build building blocks to get the unbeliever from here to become a believer over here. What we do is at the outset, presupposing the existence of the one true and living God who is triune, we then reason from the triune God to the triune God, seeking to show the unbeliever how it is that this triune God must exist and does exist. Okay? It is, in fact, proof, and it's a rational proof for the existence of God. Now, if you look at our list here, we've got two other points under the blockhouse method, which is the impossibility of the contrary and indirect proof. And I've already indicated something of where I'm heading here by dismantling the blockhouse method. Okay, the way in which we prove the existence of God is not direct; it's indirect. What do we mean by that? We're seeking to prove the existence of the triune God by the impossibility of the contrary. What does that mean? Seeking to prove the existence of God by the impossibility of the contrary. It means this. What we do is we step on the ground of the unbeliever for the sake of argument in the apologetic endeavor. And we say this: if your worldview, what you're saying about God, is true, then you cannot make sense of anything else in your experience or your existence. Okay? So, what we're seeking to do is to pull the rug out from underneath the unbeliever and to show that he or she actually has no ground upon which to stand, given his or her own presuppositions. What does the unbeliever, the atheist, presuppose? The atheist unbeliever presupposes there is no God, that everything within creation happens by chance, that everything within what they would call nature, not creation, they wouldn't call it creation because it wasn't created, it's just nature, it's just there, it always has been there, right? The unbeliever cannot account for the existence of nature. Where did it come from? Did it always exist? How could it always exist? How could it not have a beginning? Right? So forth and so on. So we're able to show by indirect proof the impossibility of the contrary, that given the presuppositions of the unbeliever, he cannot stand upon any claim that he makes in his argumentation against you. He can't. He can't substantiate it. He can't stand upon any argument that he's going to make against Christianity. And we'll talk about examples in a moment. But this is what is oftentimes called the transcendental argument. Let me transcendental argument for the existence of God. Oh, I think I just sent that to you, Rocky. Oh, I hope I haven't been putting my. Okay. Okay. Oh, oh, that's what happened, Rocky. You sent me a direct message. I thought it was a message to the group, and then I replied just to you. Okay, let me do this again. Bear with me. Change it to everyone. All right, here we go. Does everybody see that okay? The transcendental argument for the existence of God. Okay, great. So the transcendental argument, sometimes abbreviated as TAG, actually comes in various and sundry expressions. There are some good ones, and then there are some not so good ones. Some people try to attempt a transcendental argument, but it's not Van Tillian at all. So be aware of that. Some people want to presuppose the existence of a generic deity, sort of like remember we use the expression undifferentiated monad. An undifferentiated monad, God as sort of like this singular blob without any distinction at all. And of course, we don't believe that's a generic deity. It's a generic higher being, but it's not the true God. The true God is triune. Okay. He is three persons in one being and three persons. So the transcendental argument is this idea of trying to prove indirectly the existence of God by way of the impossibility of the worldview of the unbeliever. So that was a mouthful. Let me jot that down. Seeking to prove the existence of God on the basis of the impossibility of the worldview of the unbeliever. Okay, you could take that expression there, copy and paste it into your notes. That will be if you got that, you get what I'm saying. Okay, if you master that, you mastered what I'm saying. Okay, so the unbeliever has a worldview that cannot stand under its own weight. That's important to understand. The unbeliever's worldview cannot stand under its own weight. Okay. That's important to comprehend, okay, for the transcendental argument. The unbeliever's worldview cannot stand under its own weight. It cannot account for its own claims. Got that? It cannot account for its own claims. All right. And we'll talk about examples here very, very briefly, or very, very soon. Okay. So it's an indirect proof. It's not a direct proof. A direct proof, for example, is what you find in the cosmological arguments, according to Thomas Aquinas, right? It's directly upon that which you can perceive. You see the world around you, and you're able to deduce that every effect has a cause until you get all the way back to the uncaused cause, the unmoved mover. Everything is moved. I can perceive that. Therefore, there must be, at the beginning of that process of movement, one who does not move, that moves everything else. That's that's sort of a direct, logical, rational argument for the existence of God. Nothing wrong in and of itself about that. All those things are perfectly true. God really is an unmoved mover, right? But that in and of itself fails to persuade because it fails to presuppose the triune God. Okay. Only the triune God can account for things like movement, like things like origins of stuff, can account for the one and the many, the differentiation among created things and similarities among created things. Yes, Ben-Hur. The transcendental argument is seeking to show that the unbeliever's epistemology is ultimately irrational. Right. That's exactly correct. The unbeliever has no reason for his or her worldview. Quite literally has no reason for it, cannot substantiate it. It's irrational. They embrace it anyway, but they embrace it with no basis or grounds, which makes it irrational, right? If you embrace something, you believe something to be true, or you think you know something, um, not because you have a reason for it, but because you just do, arbitrarily and against all reason, that's that's called irrational. And that's exactly what you have. And I've mentioned this before, I mentioned it again. If you get a chance to listen to the Greg Bonson and Gordon Stein debate, excuse me, please do so, because and I'm speaking in a very human way here. So pardon the way in which I say this, but Bonson absolutely dismantles Stein's worldview and shows Stein to be utterly irrational, completely and utterly irrational. He shows himself to have no reason for and no basis for his belief at all. And now to God be the glory for that. So, it's not to Bonson be the glory, but to God be the glory for it. But Bonson does a wonderful, wonderful job at reducing the atheistic worldview to the absurdity and the irrationality that it is. Yeah. Great question, Ben Hur. Thank you. Um, Rocky, are you able to easily come up with a link to that Bonson Stein debate for us? I don't know. It would be helpful to drop a link if there's a version of it online. I believe there's a YouTube uh, audio of it. One day, what we should do, actually, maybe I'll work this into a future class where, as a class, we listen to the Bonson Stein debate together, and then pause it at certain points and comment and such. But it really is a clinic for how practically you as a Christian can practice the presuppositional approach to apologetics. Okay. Okay, Rocky says when atheists deny God and begin talking about him and theologizing is like a man who talks about math but denies the existence of numbers. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. Yeah, you need numbers. You need to presuppose the existence of numbers in order to do math. You need to presuppose the existence of a rational divine being before you can do reason, right? Yeah, that's exactly right. Um, part of the reason why, as an aside, we're taking this approach. This is not the approach to apologetics that has always been used in the Reformed Church, right? So there used to be classes on evidences, and there would be classes on, let's say, evolution or against evolution, and all of those things can be quite valuable. There are evidences, of course, that we can use as Christians in support of the Christian worldview, especially when we talk about the historicity of Jesus and so forth and so on. So evidences and such really have their place, and philosophical arguments and rational arguments and learning logic and all of that, they all have their place in the apologetic approach. But what what we're saying and what we're seeking to do in this class is to offer you a framework for doing apologetics so that you make sure that your theology and your apologetic method are consistent with each other. Because if they're not, then at the outset, you have no hope of being able to make a persuasive argument for the existence of God, because you've already compromised the most basic truths that God has revealed in the Bible if your method does not fit with your Reformed theology. Okay. And that's something I've been trying to hit home. And why we're doing this class is not to get into the weeds of particular evidences and particular arguments and so forth and so on, as valuable as that is and could be. But we're seeking to be able to set the framework and give the overall context the theological context for doing the practice of apologetics, right? If that makes sense. There is, of course, a great book that Van Til wrote on Christian evidences, theistic evidences. And in that book, you can read that. And once again, you'll see the way that Van Til is seeking to, frame the discussion on how we understand and use evidences as Reformed Christians. It's not like with like Josh McDowell and his book, Evidences That Demand a Verdict, if you've ever seen that. Helpful. And there are some things in there that, facts and factual claims and whatnot that are useful for apologists to have at their fingertips to be able to use in the context of a debate or argument. But if we don't understand those evidences and how to use them against the backdrop of our Reformed theology, then we're going to misuse those evidences in the attempt to defend the faith against the unbeliever. So, very good. I want to talk in just our last 7 minutes here, and thank you everyone for being patient and staying online and listening to all of this. But I want to give some concrete examples of how we can do persuasion, right? And so, the first example is arguments that people make against Christianity that you might hear is that Christianity is illogical. It's anti-logic. It's anti-reason, and we've already indicated how we as believers might respond to this. One of the ways that we would respond to it is to ask the unbeliever for them to account for logic. Not only that logic exists and is real, but also why logic is necessary for the establishment of truth. So it seems like a completely arbitrary thing for an unbeliever to come along and say, in order for me to be convinced of Christianity, it has to be logical. Well, why does it have to be logical? It is logical. But why does it have to be logical? And force the unbeliever to give an account for his or her demand for a logical system of belief. And we have a reason for it. We have a logical reason for our system of belief, right? Because we have a God who is himself perfect reason, perfect rationality. Why? Because he created reason. He created logic. Because all of creation is a reflection of who he is. And so we understand that our faith is going to be rational. It's going to be logical because our God is rational and our God is logical. But the unbeliever has no basis for saying that a system of belief has to be logical. Why does it have to be logical? Can it just be emotionally satisfying? Right? Okay. So maybe you say that emotional satisfaction is not a good basis for belief. I agree with you. Why? Why do you say that? On what basis do you say that? If all we have is chance and change over time, and that is all that exists, who's to say that the demands of logic and reason at one time don't get replaced and changed by the demand of emotional satisfaction, right? So they can't account for that. They can't account for that because if all that exists is chance and change over time, then there is no higher being. There is no triune God who himself is perfectly rational as the one and many, who gives in creation a set of laws, as it were, laws of nature that reflect his unchangeable being. So while creation does change over time, Yet over time, as things change, things also remain the same. Because in history and in creation, there is always the one and the many being held together by the one who is the original one and many. Okay? So, what is true about logic and reasoning at point A is going to be true about logic and reasoning at point Z. And together we understand that there is one truth because there is one giver of truth, creator of truth. Okay. All right. Any oh wait, let's see. Oh yeah, okay. Great. Any we'll return to that, and next week, God willing, we'll talk about the idea that Christianity is immoral and how we might answer an unbeliever who makes that claim. But before we close here, since we're just about 2 minutes from the end of our time, are there any questions or comments that I can answer or address quickly before we finish up? Ah, very good. Thank you, Rocky. You can see Rocky's dropped the Bonsenstein debate. It's a PDF file, it appears, and I don't think I've ever seen this one myself. Let's see what that. All right, cool. That, I think that will be quite useful, everyone. Oh, this looks like a transcript of the debate. Oh, this is fantastic. Oh, this is great. Yeah, so you can read it. And there is somewhere also online the debate in it's like on YouTube, but you just get the audio. There's no video, and the audio is kind of rough. It's difficult to listen to, but if you follow along with the transcript, I think you can solidify what's happening there. Any analysis of John Lennox's apologetic approach? I find it very helpful. I mean, again, he's not a presuppositionalist, or he's not doing it as he's a scientist, and he's kind of, bringing in scientific evidences that point to a creator and whatnot, and plus a host of other, the guy's a genius. But it's, I think that you can benefit, and we can benefit and learn a lot from him. But again, we want to make sure that as we use sort of that information and argumentation, that we put it in a reformed context, in a reformed way, so that as we're taking that information to the unbeliever, we realize that the unbeliever has presuppositions that will take all of the scientific evidence or arguments, so forth and so on, that are thrown at him, and he's going to pervert them, right? It's like you can throw perfect truth at an unbeliever, but the unbeliever is going to instantly twist those facts. And knowing that fact, that at the outset, any evidences or facts that we might throw at him, he's going to twist. Why? Because we understand there are no brute facts, right? God pre-interprets all facts and then tells us we have to think his thoughts after him. The unbeliever is not thinking God's thoughts after him, so he's going to twist everything at the outset. And if we understand that, I think we can use a number of these resources that are out there by evangelicals and even Catholics and others who are providing just facts, information, and even to a certain extent logical arguments. We can use all of that to the glory of God and for the benefit of defending the faith, as long as we do so and with the reformed conception about how knowledge is processed by the unbeliever. So, yeah. And we can supplement all of that, and we must supplement all of that with a transcendental argument in order to press the unbeliever to now think Christianly about the facts that somebody like John Lennox may be coming up with. So, good. All right, everyone. Well, let's close in prayer. Great class, great questions, and great interaction. I'm so very pleased, and praise the Lord for each of you, brothers. So let's pray together. Father, thank you for this time. Thank you for these brothers. Strengthen them and their families and their churches, and use the lessons that we've been learning to bring glory to your name as they have opportunities to defend the faith in the public square. May Christ be lifted up, made known, and glorified in all the earth. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you very much, sir.
Amen.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yep. Keep up the good work, guys.
Thank
God
you,
bless you
everyone.
all.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Dr.
thank
G.
you. Thank
God
you.
bless you all.
God bless.